Hello, my lovelies. One of the things that I've discovered, an uncomfortable truth that I've discovered from doing these talking head videos, is that I say or ah on average once every 6.4 seconds. The advice that public speaking experts give to people who do this, people who use fillers, is to become conscious of when you do it, and instead of saying or like or whatever your filler might be, instead to take a pause, perhaps a breath. This has the benefit of, instead of making you look disorganized and unsure of what you're saying, it's supposed to make you seem more authoritative. Also, that pause, that not being afraid of silence, gives your listeners time to absorb what it is you've just said. When actors deliberately insert pauses, it's known as taking a beat. When poets deliberately insert pauses into their poetry, it's known as a caesura, plural caesuras or caesurae. Caesurae arise naturally in poetry. They're not necessarily annotated. Quite often they are indicated by punctuation, most often a comma or a full stop or a semicolon, but they're not necessarily annotated at all. They're first one, not bad after a minute and a half. That's better than once every 6.4 seconds. Yeah, what was I saying? Caesura are not necessarily annotated. They arise in the natural patterns of speech. You need to breathe. If you don't breathe, it becomes pretty difficult to read poetry or indeed to live. Let's think of an example. 4 and 20 blackbirds. 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. There's a natural pause in the reading of that. I want to emphasize the idea of a caesura being a moment of pause, a moment in which to absorb what went before. It's possibly, and we can think of this particularly in terms of actors taking a beat, it's to create a sense of anticipation for what's to come. Let's park that idea and for a moment go back to what I was saying in my last video, the video about Carol Ann Duffy's sonnet, Anne Hathaway. In that video, I talked about what are the limits of a sonnet. What are the rules of a sonnet, and how many rules can you break and there still be a sonnet? I talked about there being 14 lines to a sonnet and gave examples where there are sonnets that are not 14 lines. I talked about it being in iambic, about them being in iambic pentameter. And there are many examples of sonnets which are not in iambic pentameter. I talked about rhyme schemes. There are certain defined rhyme schemes that are expected, Shakespearean, Spenserian, and Petrarchan, and there are poems, sonnets, that do not fulfill those rhyme schemes, that invent their own rhyme schemes or dispense with them altogether, as for example Carol Ann Duffy's sonnet. There is one last defining characteristic of a sonnet, and that's the volta. That's the gap, the moment for pause and reflection between one part of the sonnet and the next part of the sonnet. And in the second part of the sonnet, there's a looking back at what went before, perhaps an explanation of it, perhaps an answer, a call and response action that's going on. And to me, I know there are examples of sonnets that claim the name sonnet that do dispense with the volta, but for me, that's a step too far. That, for me, is the defining characteristic of a volta, of a sonnet. It has to have a volta. It has to have a sense of call and response. and it helps if it's got 14 lines, if it's an iambic pentameter, if it follows a defined rhyme scheme, but all those things are dispensable. Without the volta, then it's no longer a sonnet as far as I'm concerned. That's my opinion. I don't think there's any literary authority for that, but that's how it feels to me. Which brings me, perhaps bizarrely, to the subject of haiku. Now, if you were taught haiku in school, you were almost certainly taught that it's a 17-syllable poem in 3 phrases with 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. And that definition makes me extremely uncomfortable. Now, particularly when it's used in a teaching context, it just seems such lazy teaching to me to describe a haiku that way and then send the kids off with homework to write a haiku. Or even worse, I've heard instances where the material has been covered, the teacher still has 10 minutes left of the lesson, and they fill the time by telling the kids to write a haiku because it's something you can knock off in 5 minutes. That makes me so uncomfortable. Like sonnets, like other forms of poetry, haiku has a set of rules. And first and foremost, among those rules, the defining characteristic of a haiku is that it contains a moment of pause, a moment of reflection. That moment is, in the case of haiku, marked by a word called a kiraji. Kire means cut, ji means word. Kiraji is a cutting word. And there's a pretty limited set of these words, which are used in much the same way as punctuation. When translated into English, these are normally translated as some form of punctuation which indicates a caesura. Because we don't have any equivalent of any direct equivalent of a kiraji. Much lower down the list of things that makes a haiku is this 5-7-5 structure. And I really want to emphasize that the things that there are 5, 7 and 5 of are not syllables, not in the sense that we English speakers understand them. They're on or more, if we want the pseudo-Greek term for them. On simply means sound. They directly correlate to hiragana, which is the alphabet in inverted commas that school children learn in Japan when they're learning their language before they start learning kanji, the Chinese derived, more complex word equivalent symbols in their language. So you can spell out a word in Japanese phonetically using hiragana, and each individual hiragana relates to an on, which is typically a consonant followed by a vowel. It's a much smaller unit of meaning, much smaller unit of sound than an English language syllable. It's said that the 17 on of a haiku relate roughly in terms of content to 12 English language syllables. But it's not a hard and fast rule. Basho is to Japanese writing as Shakespeare is to English writing. I think living at roughly the same sort of time, if I remember correctly. He was the great master of the haiku, and even he didn't follow 5-7-5 religiously. Modern haiku writers follow it much, much less. The third quality that defines a haiku is that it contains a word that describes a season or that indicates a season, and there are books, or there is a book, that lists all the words that you can use. There's a few hundred, but only a few hundred words that must appear in your haiku in order to define the season that you're in. Modern haiku writers either ignore that list of words and use their own, or ignore the whole idea of seasonal indications. There's also a tradition that haiku have to be about the natural world. I don't think that's ever been such a thing as a rule, but it's, again, in modern writing, certainly widely ignored. But what is not ignored, what is never ignored, is the kiraji, the moment of reflection between one part of the haiku and another. So I feel there are strong connections between haiku and sonnets, and the way when we write haiku in English, or when we translate haiku from Japanese into English, the way that we indicate that kiraji or volta is with a caesura. This concept, these ideas, are obviously imposing an entirely Western view of prosody, the structure of poetry, onto a Japanese culture, completely alien culture that is completely uninfluenced by Western prosody. But I think that the parallels are extremely interesting, and that's why I wanted to share this with you, because it gives me joy. Hello again, I'm back because on watching the video that I've just recorded, I realised that I've missed out something absolutely crucial in describing the difference between a volta and a kiraji. Whereas a volta is the gap between one part of a poem and another, where the two relate to one another in an obvious kind of way, where you have a call and a response. That's not quite the same with a kiraji, although it's also a gap between two parts of the poem which you're supposed to relate to one another. Those two parts, sometimes described as a phrase and a fragment, those two parts are intended to reveal, when taken together, they're intended to reveal to the reader something subtler, something that is not actually said. It's about what isn't there more than it is about what's there. So the kiraji provides a kind of doorway so you can go behind the words and deduce for yourself what it might mean. The fact, when you take into account what one part of the poem says, taken together with what the other part of the poem says. So it's not like a call and response. It's not like a question and an answer. It's not like a description and an explanation. It's like two separate but related ideas that, taken together, mean much more than the whole is much more than the sum of the parts. And that's what's indicated by the kiraji. Moreover, I mentioned that there are a number of defined words, and those words are associated with emotions. They don't have specific meaning, they don't have specific translations, but they have an emotional content which is an indication of how to feel about the connection between the two parts of the poem. That's probably all as clear as mud, but it's interesting all the same.